Comment on this video and tell me what ancient topic you want covered next, because I genuinely read every single comment and picked the next video from them. And while you're getting comfortable, hit like and subscribe to Sleepy Silent so more of these long, slow history documentaries can keep coming. And now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's go back 2,000 years, because tonight we're not talking about wars or emperors or famous battles. Tonight we're talking about something much smaller and much stranger. Something every single human being on Earth has had to deal with since the beginning of time: hair, and specifically what people did when it grew too long. Because somewhere between the Stone Age and the fall of Rome, human beings had to solve a problem that still exists today. Hair keeps growing, and if you don't do something about it, it gets in your eyes, it gets in your food, it gets caught on branches, it gets infested with lice. And so across every civilization on this planet, completely independent of one another, people invented their own strange and clever solutions long before anyone had ever seen a pair of scissors as we know them, and long before anyone had a mirror to check if they did a good job. And tonight we're going to slowly walk through all of it, civilization by civilization, tool by tool, ritual by ritual, and if at any point your eyes get heavy, that's exactly what this video is for. So let them close and just listen, because long before razors were sold in stores, long before barbershops had red and white poles outside them, the very first hair removal tools on this planet were not made of metal at all. They were made of shell, sharpened clam shells that early humans held between their fingers like crude tweezers, plucking hair strand by strand, one at a time, slowly, patiently. And if you think about how long that must have taken, sitting there in the dim light of a cave fire, plucking hair one strand at a time with a shell, you start to understand just how much humans have always cared about how they looked. This wasn't just survival. This was grooming. This was identity. And alongside these shell tweezers, early humans discovered something else: sharpened flint, a stone that could hold an edge when struck and shaped correctly. And once flint entered the picture, cutting hair stopped being about plucking and started being about slicing. A sharpened flint blade pressed against a lock of hair could shear through it in a way that a shell never could. And this technique, using stone blades to cut hair and shave beards, would go on to last for tens of thousands of years before anyone even dreamed of metal tools. And it's worth sitting with that for a moment. Tens of thousands of years, an almost incomprehensible stretch of time during which the most advanced hair tool available to any human being on the planet was a sharpened piece of rock, picked up from a riverbed, napped into an edge by hand, and used again and again until it grew dull, and then discarded for a new one. No barbershops, no appointments, no mirrors, just a rock and a steady hand. And slowly, as human societies grew more complex, as people began settling into villages and towns, instead of wandering as small hunting bands, hair grooming stopped being a purely practical act and started to mean something more. It started to say something about who you were. And nowhere is that more obvious than in ancient Egypt, because the Egyptians, more than almost any other civilization in the ancient world, were obsessed, genuinely obsessed, with personal hygiene and grooming. And this wasn't vanity in the way we might think of it today. In Egypt, cleanliness was tied directly to religion, to purity, to your standing before the gods. And one of the most fascinating and honestly a little unsettling practices to come out of ancient Egypt involved the priesthood, because Egyptian priests, in order to remain ritually pure enough to enter the inner sanctuaries of the temples and stand before the statues of the gods, were required to shave every single hair off their entire body. Not just their face, not just their head. Every hair, arms, legs, chest, everywhere. And they had to do this every few days, over and over, for their entire careers as priests, because body hair was considered unclean, a barrier between the priest and the divine presence he was meant to serve. And think about Logistics of that for a moment. An entire class of religious officials whose daily or near-daily routine involved being shaved completely bare using nothing but early copper razors and abrasive pastes made from ground pumice and natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture the Egyptians also used in mummification. And beyond the priesthood, ordinary Egyptians took grooming incredibly seriously too. Archaeologists have found copper razors and even gold razors buried in tombs dating back to around 3,000 to 2,500 years before our era. These razors often had round or crescent-shaped heads, and they were used along with water and abrasive pastes to make shaving smoother and less painful, and Egyptian barbershops, or at least the areas where barbers worked, became common fixtures in towns, with skilled barbers using copper razors and pumice stones to shave clients, then finishing the service with perfumed oils and lotions massaged into the skin. And this idea that a haircut or a shave should end with something soothing, something relaxing, something almost ceremonial, is one that would echo forward through nearly every civilization we're going to talk about tonight. And if you're already starting to feel your eyelids grow heavy, good. Because we're only just getting started, and there is so much more slow, gentle history left to go through. So just relax, keep listening, and let the details wash over you like warm water. Because next we travel from the banks of the Nile to the plains of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers where an entirely different attitude toward hair took hold. Because in ancient Mesopotamia and Babylon, it wasn't a shaved head that signified status. It was the opposite. It was the beard, and not just any beard, but a long, thick, elaborately oiled and curled beard. Because in Mesopotamian culture, a full beard was a direct symbol of power, of masculinity, of wisdom and authority. Kings and nobles would spend enormous amounts of time and resources having their beards oiled, perfumed, and carefully curled into tight ringlets using early forms of curling tools and combs, and slaves or lower status men, by contrast, were often required to keep their faces bare or their beards short and unkempt, because in that society, the beard itself was almost like a uniform, a visual signal of exactly where you stood in the social order. And Mesopotamian barbers, much like their Egyptian counterparts, held a respected position in society. They were entrusted not just with cutting hair, but with maintaining an entire visual language of status and rank. And this is something that's easy to forget when we think about ancient history. We tend to imagine kings and pharaohs and generals, but behind almost every one of them stood a barber, a person with a blade close to the most powerful people in the world, trusted completely. Because one wrong move with a sharpened blade against the throat of a king would have been the end of that barber's life. And so barbers across the ancient world were not just craftsmen, they were confidants. They heard everything. They saw everything. And in many cultures, they became keepers of secrets simply because of how close their work brought them to the powerful. And from Mesopotamia, let's drift toward ancient Greece, a civilization with, frankly, a complicated relationship with hair. Because for a long stretch of early Greek history, long hair on men was seen as a sign of freedom and nobility. Only slaves or those in mourning were expected to cut their hair short, and Greek beards, thick and full, were worn with pride. Philosophers in particular were almost expected to have long flowing beards, as if wisdom itself needed a beard to hang from. But Greek boys did undergo one particular hair ritual that is worth pausing on, because it's genuinely touching in a strange way. It was called the Kureon, a coming-of-age ceremony in which a young boy, usually around the age of 16, would cut off the long curls of hair he had worn since childhood and offer them as a sacrifice to a god, often Apollo, symbolically marking his transition from boyhood into the responsibilities of manhood. And this wasn't a private, quiet moment either. It was often done publicly. sometimes as part of larger religious festivals, with the cut curls placed on an altar or in a sacred grove as an offering. And it's a beautiful reminder that a haircut, something we think of today as a mundane errand squeezed between work and dinner, was once treated as sacred, as a genuine turning point in a person's life, worthy of gods and altars and public ceremony. And then everything changed in Greece, rather suddenly, because of one man, Alexander the Great, who in the 4th century before our era made a decision that would ripple through military and grooming culture. For centuries afterward, Alexander ordered his soldiers to shave their beards completely. And the reasoning behind this order was brutally practical. In close combat, an enemy could grab a soldier by his beard, yank his head forward or sideways, and deliver a killing blow before the bearded man could even react. A beard, in other words, had become a battlefield liability, a handle for your enemy to grab. And so Alexander, ever the strategist, decided his men would go clean-shaven. And because Alexander was Alexander, because his army swept across most of the known world at the time, this practice of shaving spread with his conquests. Clean-shaven faces slowly became associated with military discipline, with civilization, with a kind of modernity, and after his death, this trend continued to influence Greek and later Roman standards of male grooming for generations. And speaking of Rome, we now arrive at what might be the single richest chapter in this entire story. Because Roman attitudes toward hair, shaving, and barbershops tell us more about daily Roman life than almost any other single topic. Because in Rome, a clean-shaven face wasn't just a personal preference, it was a marker of civilization. Itself, Romans considered a smooth, well-groomed face a sign of high social status and cultural refinement, in stark contrast to what they viewed as the wild, unkempt beards of the so-called barbarian tribes beyond their borders. And Roman men who could afford it employed a skilled household servant specifically to shave them at home. But for the vast majority of Roman men, the shave or the haircut happened at the tonsure, the Roman barbershop. And the tonsur's shop was so much more than a place to get groomed. It functioned as a genuine social hub, a place where men gathered not only to have their beards trimmed and their hair cut with early bronze and iron scissors and razors, but to hear the latest news, to catch up on gossip, to debate politics, to simply sit and talk for an hour while a barber worked. And this idea of the barbershop as a community gathering space, a place for conversation as much as grooming, is a tradition that has honestly survived in one form or another for over 2,000 years, right up to the barbershops that still exist in towns and cities all over the world today. And one particularly meaningful Roman tradition involved a young man's very first shave. This event, called the Depositio Barbie, was treated as a genuine coming-of-age celebration, almost like a small party. The first clippings of a young Roman's beard were sometimes collected and dedicated to a household god, tucked away as an offering, marking his passage from boyhood into recognized manhood within Roman society. And it's worth noting that Roman scissors themselves were undergoing real technical improvement around this time too. Around 400 years before our era, Roman craftsmen introduced pivoted scissors, meaning two blades connected at a central point by a pivot or rivet, which allowed for a scissoring motion that was far more controlled and precise than the earlier spring scissors that had been used across the ancient Near East for centuries. Those earlier spring scissors, found in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt as far back as 1,500 years before our era, were essentially a single piece of bent metal shaped into a U-form. The user would squeeze the two blades together to cut, and the metal's natural springiness would pull them back open again afterward. It was clever, but it lacked the fine control that a pivoted design offered, and Roman barbers, now equipped with These improved pivoted shears were able to offer far more precise haircuts and beard trims to their clients, and while the men of Rome were visiting the tonsure for haircuts and shaves, Roman women were dealing with hair removal in their own way, using razors and pumice stones on their legs and other parts of the body, and also creating homemade depilatory creams and pastes from various substances. Some of them, frankly, quite dangerous by modern standards. Involving harsh plant compounds and minerals, women also plucked their eyebrows into fashionable shapes using early bronze tweezers. And much like the men, wealthier Roman women often had enslaved household staff dedicated specifically to hair care and styling, elaborate braided and curled hairstyles held together with pins and early forms. Of hair oil were a significant status symbol among Roman elite women, with certain hairstyles even being associated with specific empresses and copied by fashionable women across the empire, almost like a form of ancient celebrity influence. And let's drift now, slowly, further north, away from the warmth of the Mediterranean, up to the cold coastlines and fjords of the Viking world, because contrary to the popular modern image of Vikings as wild, unkempt raiders with matted hair and tangled beards, archaeological evidence tells a very different story. Viking men and women appear to have taken grooming remarkably seriously. Excavations of Viking burial sites have uncovered combs, often beautifully carved from bone or antler, buried alongside the dead as personal possessions important enough to carry into the next life. And this detail alone tells us something meaningful, that a comb wasn't just a tool to the Vikings. It was personal, valuable, worth taking with you into the afterlife, and Viking hairstyles carried social meaning too. Long hair and well-maintained beards were associated with free men and status, while cutting a man's hair short against his will or forcibly shaving his beard was sometimes used as a punishment or a mark of humiliation, a way of visibly stripping someone of their dignity and status in front of the community. And this idea of hair as a symbol of freedom and the forced cutting of hair as a symbol of subjugation or punishment appears again and again across cultures throughout history. It's a thread that connects the Vikings back to ancient Rome, where slaves were often required to keep their hair short as a visible marker separating them from free citizens. And it connects forward, too, into the medieval period, where an entirely different kind of hair-cutting ritual took hold, this time within the walls of monasteries across Europe, because Christian monks adopted a specific and very deliberate hairstyle known as the tonsure, in which the hair on the crown of the head was shaved completely bare, while a ring of hair around the sides and back was left intact, creating a distinctive circular bald patch on top. And this wasn't done for comfort or practicality. It was deeply symbolic, representing humility, the renunciation of vanity, and a visible, permanent sign of a monk's devotion to religious life. A tonsure couldn't be hidden under a hat during working hours. It announced to everyone who saw it exactly what kind of life that man had chosen. And interestingly, in medieval Europe, the person responsible for maintaining a monk's tonsure and for cutting hair and trimming beards generally among the wider population was very often the exact same person responsible for far more serious medical procedures, because in the medieval period, barbers and surgeons were frequently one and the same profession, known as barber surgeons. These men didn't just cut hair, they pulled teeth. They performed bloodletting, a common medical treatment at the time believed to balance the body's humors, and they even carried out minor surgical procedures, all using many of the same sharp tools they used for shaving and hair cutting. And this strange dual profession is actually the origin of the red and white striped barber pole that many barbershops still display outside their doors, even today. The red representing blood, and the white representing the bandages used in these old bloodletting procedures. A small, strange, and genuinely surprising piece of history hiding in plain sight on a street corner near you. And if we travel further east during this same broad era, we find yet another completely different relationship with hair. In India, barbers held a distinct and specific place within the traditional social structure, often belonging to a hereditary caste known as the Nai. And far from being a minor or low-status role, barbers in Indian villages and towns often served as essential community figures, present at births, weddings, and religious ceremonies, sometimes acting as informal messengers or even matchmakers between families, because their work brought them into close, trusted contact with nearly every household in a community, and religious head-shaving rituals were, and still are, deeply significant in various Indian traditions, with the shaving of a child's first hair, known in some traditions as a mundan ceremony, marking an important early milestone in a person's life. A ritual removal of hair from birth believed to cleanse a person spiritually and mark a fresh beginning. And let's drift now, slowly, even further east, past India, all the way to ancient China, because Chinese attitudes toward hair were shaped by something almost entirely different from anything we've discussed so far tonight. Not fashion, not military practicality, not even religious purity in the way the Egyptians understood it, but a deep, quiet philosophical idea rooted in the teachings of Confucius, who lived roughly 2,500 years ago, and who taught that a person's body, every part of it, down to the hair on their head and the skin covering their bones, was a gift given directly by their parents, and that damaging or cutting away any part of that gift, without good reason, was a small act of disrespect toward the very people who had given you life. This idea is recorded in an old text called the Classic of Filial Piety, and it shaped Chinese grooming customs for centuries afterward, because once a person reached adulthood, considered to be around 20 years old for young men and 15 for young women, they were expected to stop cutting their hair almost entirely, letting it grow long for the rest of their lives. And instead of cutting it, men and women alike would wind their long hair up into a neat coiled bun or top knot, high on the crown of the head, sometimes held in place with an early form of hairpin carved from bone, jade, or wood, and sometimes covered with a small cap. And this single hairstyle, the top knot, became so deeply tied to Chinese cultural identity that wearing your hair loose and unbound, the way outsiders or so-called barbarian peoples were imagined to wear theirs, was seen as a mark of being uncivilized, of standing outside proper society altogether. And because hair was treated with this kind of reverence, cutting someone's hair against their will became one of the most severe punishments a Chinese court could hand down. This punishment had a name, kungsing, and it was used as an official criminal penalty for well over 1,000 years, from the very early Chinese dynasties all the way through later imperial periods. And what's fascinating about this punishment is that it caused no physical pain and left no lasting physical injury at all. And yet it was considered genuinely harsh because it permanently marked a person in public as someone who had failed, who had been shamed, who no longer held the same standing among their peers. There's actually a recorded case from a period known as the Three Kingdoms era, roughly 1,700 years ago, where a historian named Chen Shou wrote about watching his own father endure exactly this punishment, having his hair forcibly cut as a penalty after a failed military campaign. And the shame of that single haircut apparently followed the family for a long time afterward. And it's a small but powerful reminder that in ancient China, unlike in Rome or Greece where a fresh haircut was often a celebration, a haircut forced upon you by someone else could be one of the worst things that could happen to your public reputation. And just across the water from China, in ancient Japan, hair carried its own set of meanings too, with samurai warriors eventually adopting the now iconic top-knot hairstyle known as the chanmage, in which the top of the head was shaved and the remaining hair was oiled, gathered, and folded forward into a neat queue. Partly for practical reasons, since it helped a heavy iron helmet sit more securely and comfortably on the head during long hours of battle, and partly as a visible symbol of status and discipline within the warrior class. And now let's turn westward again, back across the vast stretch of the ancient world to the Celtic and Gallic tribes of what is now France, Britain, and Ireland. Peoples who the Romans themselves wrote about extensively. Often with a strange mixture of fascination and disdain, Roman writers described Celtic warriors as taking great pride in long, thick hair, sometimes stiffened and spiked upward using a mixture of lime wash, giving their hair a bleached, almost mane-like appearance meant to make them look larger and more intimidating on the battlefield. And Celtic men were also noted for wearing long, sweeping mustaches, even when the rest of the face was kept relatively bare, a very distinct look compared to the clean-shaven Roman soldiers marching against them. And just like nearly every other culture we've discussed tonight, hairstyle among the Celts was closely tied to rank, with certain elaborate styles reserved specifically for nobles, druids, and warriors of high standing, while common people wore their hair in simpler, more practical ways. And if we drift briefly toward ancient Persia as well, we find yet another culture where a long, carefully oiled and curled beard was considered a mark of dignity and royal authority. Persian kings and nobles were often depicted in stone carvings with intricately layered curls in their beards, arranged almost like rows of tightly coiled rope, a look that would have taken servants a considerable amount of time and skill to achieve and maintain. And stepping back from all of these individual cultures for just a moment, it's worth pausing on something quietly remarkable, and that is just how much labor, real, physical human labor, went into hair care across the ancient world before any kind of automation existed. Every single wave, curl, braid, shave, or top knot we've talked about tonight was created entirely by hand, using tools that had to be sharpened by hand, using oils and pastes that had to be mixed and prepared by hand, often by servants or enslaved workers whose names history never bothered to record, standing for hours behind a chair, working strand by strand, so that someone else could walk out into the world looking exactly the way their society expected them to look. And there's something quietly humbling in that, in realizing that behind almost every powerful figure from the ancient world, every pharaoh, every emperor, every king, there stood an ordinary, unnamed person with a blade or a comb in their hand, doing patient, careful, repetitive work, the same kind of quiet, patient, repetitive work that, frankly, is exactly the kind of thing that tends to help a tired mind slow down and drift toward sleep, and returning briefly to Rome before we bring this all together tonight. It's worth mentioning that Roman hairstyles for women went through distinct waves of fashion, almost like modern trends, with certain empresses setting styles that spread across the entire empire. Tall built-up curls supported with wire frames during one era, softer waved styles pulled back into low buns during another, and wealthy women sometimes used false hair pieces, or wigs made from hair imported from conquered territories, particularly hair from Germanic and other northern peoples, which was prized for its lighter color, a small but telling detail about how interconnected and far-reaching even something as personal as hairstyling had already become 2,000 years ago. And before we cross back over into Europe again, it's worth taking a slow, unhurried detour across the ocean to the civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica, because the Aztec and Maya peoples had their own distinct and highly structured ideas about hair. In Aztec society, hairstyle was almost like a uniform of rank and achievement. Warriors were required to wear their hair in specific styles that directly reflected how many enemies they had captured in battle. A young warrior who had not yet taken a captive wore his hair in a particular unremarkable way. But as he achieved more in battle, his hairstyle changed, becoming more elaborate, sometimes involving a long lock of hair grown and tied on one side of the head as a badge of honor visible to the entire community. And Aztec priests, much like Egyptian priests thousands of miles and thousands of years away, followed their own strict grooming rules, though in an almost opposite direction. Rather than shaving completely bare, many Aztec priests were forbidden from cutting their hair at all for long stretches tied to religious service, allowing it to grow long, matted, and unkempt as a visible sign of their devotion and separation from ordinary daily life. And among the Maya, elongated foreheads achieved through infant head shaping were paired with elaborate hairstyles later in life, with nobility often shaving portions of the head while leaving long sections elsewhere, sometimes woven with ornaments, feathers, or fabric. Hair among the Maya elite functioned almost like a canvas, a place to display wealth and status through decoration rather than through the hairstyle's shape alone. And if we drift now down into sub-Saharan Africa during this same broad era, we find some of the most intricate hair traditions in the entire ancient world. Because many African societies developed elaborate braiding techniques thousands of years old, techniques so precise and so regionally distinct that a trained eye could look at a person's braided pattern and immediately know which community, which family, sometimes even which specific status or marital position that person held within their society. Braiding sessions themselves were, and still are in many places, deeply social events, often taking many hours, sometimes an entire day, with women gathering together, talking, singing, sharing news, while one person's hair was carefully sectioned and woven strand by strand into patterns passed down from mother to daughter for generations. And this idea of hair grooming as a slow, communal, almost meditative social activity rather than a quick individual errand is something that appears again and again across ancient cultures, and it stands in gentle contrast to how quickly and impersonally many of us think about a haircut today. And now, let's drift back across the world one more time to the eastern edge of what had once been the Roman Empire, to Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire that carried Roman traditions forward for another 1,000 years after Rome itself had fallen. And in Byzantine society, hair and beard length became deeply tied to religious and imperial identity as well. Orthodox Christian priests and monks were expected to wear long, uncut beards as a sign of humility, wisdom, and devotion, a stark contrast to the clean-shaven ideal that had once defined Roman masculinity centuries earlier. And Byzantine emperors themselves were almost always depicted in official portraits and mosaics with full, carefully groomed beards, a visual signal of authority, maturity, and continuity with older traditions of rulership stretching all the way back to the bearded kings of Mesopotamia we talked about earlier tonight. And it's a strange, slow, moving irony worth sitting with for a moment, that the clean-shaven look Alexander the Great had once spread across the known world through military necessity eventually gave way, centuries later, back to the very same bearded ideal of authority and wisdom that had existed long before him. Fashions, it turns out, even fashions in facial hair, tend to move in long, slow circles across the centuries, rising, falling, and eventually returning again in a slightly different form. And if we return once more to medieval Europe, past the barber surgeons and their bloodletting bowls, past the monks with their humble tonsures, we find that ordinary village life also had its own quiet rhythms around hair. Most villages were far too small and far too poor to support a dedicated professional barber the way a large Roman city could, and so haircutting in rural medieval communities often fell to whoever in the family or village happened to have a steady hand and a sharp enough blade. Sometimes a local blacksmith, sometimes an older relative, sometimes a traveling tinker passing through who offered haircuts alongside pot repairs and knife sharpening as a small side trade. And this image, a tinker sitting, Outside a village home on a wooden stool, sharpening knives with one hand and trimming a farmer's hair with the other while children watched curiously nearby, is such a small, quiet, almost forgotten piece of daily medieval life, the kind of ordinary moment that never made it into any history book about kings or wars. But that happened, quietly, over and over, in thousands of small villages across Europe, for centuries. And if you think about just how many millions of these small, unrecorded haircuts happened across the ancient and medieval world, in Roman tonsors and Egyptian temples and Viking longhouses and Chinese courtyards and African braiding circles and quiet European villages, haircut after haircut after haircut, stretching back tens of thousands of years, it becomes almost impossible to fully hold in your mind an unbroken, quiet thread of human care and maintenance running silently underneath every single empire, every war, every famous historical event you've ever learned about in school. While all of that grand history was happening in the foreground, this small, patient, repetitive human ritual was happening constantly in the background, largely unrecorded, mostly forgotten, and yet, somehow, through scattered tomb paintings and buried combs and old court records about punishments and stone carvings of curled beards and worn-out copper razors pulled from the dust, tiny fragments of it have survived long enough for us to piece back together tonight, slowly, quietly, here in the dark. And if your eyes are heavy right now, that's all right. Just let this slow, unbroken thread of human history carry you along gently. There is still a little more to go, so simply relax and let it keep moving quietly through your mind. And there's another quiet thread running through almost every one of these civilizations that we haven't touched on yet tonight, and that is the surprisingly universal practice of cutting or shaving hair specifically as an act of mourning. Because in ancient Greece, as we mentioned earlier, long hair was so valued that cutting it short was considered almost a punishment, reserved mainly for slaves. And yet there was one major exception to that rule, and that exception was grief. When a Greek family lost a loved one, it was common for close relatives, especially women, to cut off a lock of their own hair and place it directly on the body of the deceased before burial, or lay it upon the funeral pyre as the body was cremated. This wasn't seen as a punishment or a loss of status at all. It was seen as an offering, a physical piece of the living given willingly to accompany the dead, a small, tangible symbol of love and loss that the mourner would carry with them, quite literally, as a visible mark on their own body for months afterward as their hair slowly grew back. And this same basic idea, cutting hair as a formal, visible expression of mourning, appears independently in ancient Egypt, where in certain periods, professional mourners hired to grieve loudly and dramatically at funerals would tear at and cut their hair as part of an elaborate, almost theatrical performance of grief meant to honor the deceased and demonstrate to onlookers just how significant that person's life and death truly were. And it appears again among certain ancient Jewish and Near Eastern traditions recorded in old religious texts, where shaving the head or cutting the beard during periods of deep mourning was a recognized, expected practice, a way of visibly setting mourning time apart from ordinary daily life. And it appears yet again among various Native American nations, where cutting one's hair short after the death of a close family member was, and in some communities still is, a deeply meaningful gesture of grief and respect, a way of saying, through the body itself, that something important has been lost, and that ordinary vanity no longer matters in this moment. And it's worth sitting quietly with that pattern for a moment. The fact that so many unconnected cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, with no possible way of influencing one another, independently arrived at the exact same instinct that grief deserves a visible mark, and that hair, something so closely tied to personal identity and vanity in ordinary life, becomes the natural place to make that mark when someone dies. And speaking of hair and identity, we should also spend a slow, quiet moment on something almost every ancient culture eventually had to deal with: hair dye. Because vanity around hair color is nowhere near a modern invention. Ancient Egyptians used henna, a natural plant-based dye, to color both hair and nails, giving hair a reddish tint that was considered attractive and was also believed to have practical benefits, since henna has mild antifungal properties that may have helped with certain scalp conditions in a hot desert climate. And Roman men and women went even further, developing recipes for both lightening and darkening hair depending on the fashion of the moment. Some Roman hair lightening formulas involved applying mixtures containing quicklime or ash and leaving them exposed to direct sunlight for extended periods to bleach the hair lighter, a slow, uncomfortable, and honestly somewhat dangerous process by modern standards. While darker dyes were sometimes made from boiled walnut shells or from a mixture involving lead, which, unbeknownst to Roman society at the time, was slowly poisoning many of the people who used it regularly. And ancient Chinese texts also describe the use of natural plant-based dyes to maintain black hair color well into old age, since silver or white hair, despite the cultural respect given to elders, was still something many older individuals across many cultures quietly wished to hide or delay for as long as possible, a very human impulse that clearly hasn't changed in thousands of years. And let's talk for a moment, slowly, about something far less glamorous but arguably far more historically important than any hairstyle: lice. Because head lice were a near universal problem across almost every single ancient civilization we've discussed tonight. And this fact alone explains an enormous amount about why so many cultures developed such an intense, almost obsessive relationship with combing. Archaeologists have found finely toothed combs, specifically designed with teeth close enough together to physically remove lice, and there, eggs from hair, in Egyptian tombs, in Viking graves, in ancient Chinese burial sites, and in Roman households. These fine combs were often double-sided, with wider teeth on one edge for detangling and much finer, tightly spaced teeth on the other edge, specifically for lice removal. And the sheer number of these combs found by archaeologists across so many different cultures tells us something quietly important, that for the average ordinary person throughout most of ancient history, hair care wasn't really about achieving some elaborate curled or braided style at all. It was about the slow, patient, repetitive daily task of simply keeping your hair clean and free of parasites. A task that had to be repeated over and over, night after night, for an entire lifetime. And there's something almost meditative in imagining that scene. A parent slowly combing a child's hair by firelight every single evening, working section by section, checking carefully the same quiet, repetitive motion happening in Roman homes and Viking longhouses and Egyptian mud brick houses and Chinese courtyards, completely unconnected to one another, and yet almost identical in rhythm. And finally, before we bring everything together, tonight, it's worth spending a slow moment on wigs, because false hair has an ancient history stretching back much further than most people realize. Ancient Egyptians of higher status regularly wore elaborate wigs made from human hair, plant fibers, or wool, often styled into tight braids or curls, and sometimes scented with beeswax and perfumed cones designed to slowly melt throughout the day, releasing fragrance. Wigs in Egypt served a genuinely practical purpose too, since many wealthy Egyptians, and certainly the priests we discussed earlier, kept their natural hair shaved completely bare for hygiene and religious purity, and would then wear a wig for social occasions, essentially separating the practical, hygienic reality of a shaved head from the fashionable, decorative appearance expected in public life. And Roman wig culture, as mentioned earlier, relied heavily on imported hair from northern territories, with lighter blonde and reddish hair harvested from Germanic regions being especially prized and expensive among fashionable Roman women who wanted their elaborate towering hairstyles to stand out in exactly the shade that was currently in vogue. And it's genuinely remarkable to realize that something as specific and modern sounding as an international trade network supplying human hair for wigs and hairpieces was already fully operating 2,000 years ago, connecting distant conquered territories in the north all the way to fashionable households in the heart of Rome. And let's slow down even further and spend a little more time on the ancient Levant, the region we now call Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Because in the Hebrew Bible, hair and beard laws are actually written down explicitly. Ancient Israelite men were instructed not to shave the edges of their beards or cut the hair at their temples in certain rounded ways associated with surrounding pagan mourning practices, a rule that many scholars believe was meant to visibly separate the Israelites from neighboring cultures whose grooming rituals were tied to the worship of other gods. And this same tradition of leaving the hair at the temples uncut, known today as payot, is still visibly practiced by some Orthodox Jewish communities in the modern world, meaning this particular grooming custom has continued, largely unbroken, for well over 2,000 years, an almost unimaginable span of continuity for something as small and personal as where exactly a person chooses to trim their hair. And there's also the well-known biblical story of Samson, a man whose immense strength was said to be tied directly to his uncut hair, and whose downfall came the moment his hair was secretly cut while he slept. A story that, regardless of how you personally read it, shows just how deeply ancient Near Eastern culture associated hair with personal power, identity, and even spiritual strength itself. And if we cross the ocean one final time tonight, to South America, to the Inca Empire high in the Andes Mountains, we find yet another distinct relationship with hair. Inca nobility and officials were expected to maintain specific hairstyles that immediately signaled their rank and role within the empire's highly organized administrative system. Hair length and style functioned almost like a uniform or an identification badge in a society that governed an enormous, mountainous territory without a written language in the way we understand it, relying instead on visual and symbolic systems, including dress and hairstyle, to instantly communicate a person's place within the social order to anyone who saw them. And now, let's slow down completely and spend just a little more quiet time thinking about the tools themselves, the physical objects that made all of this possible across every single one of these civilizations. Because the story of hair cutting is really, underneath everything else, a story about metallurgy, about which metals different societies had learned to shape into a fine enough edge to cut something as thin and fine as a single strand of hair. The earliest metal tools were made of copper, a soft metal that could be shaped relatively easily, but that dulled quickly and needed constant resharpening. This is the metal the earliest Egyptian razors were made from around 5,000 years ago. And then, gradually, across the ancient Near East, people discovered that mixing copper with a small amount of tin created bronze, a significantly harder and more durable metal, and bronze razors and scissors, like the ones later refined by Roman craftsmen into the pivoted design we discussed earlier, held their edge far longer than copper ever could. And finally, iron, and eventually steel, an even harder and more refined material, began slowly replacing bronze tools across most of the ancient world in the centuries leading up to 2,000 years ago, meaning that a person getting their hair cut in Rome or Greece around the time period we've been focusing on tonight would very likely have felt the cool touch of an iron or early steel blade against their skin, a direct technological ancestor of the steel razors and scissors still used by barbers and shops all over the world today. And if you ever sit down in a modern barbershop, and hear the quiet metallic snip of scissors opening and closing near your ear, that exact same pivoted mechanical motion, blade crossing over blade around a central point, is fundamentally, mechanically, almost identical to the design Roman barbers were using on their clients 2,000 years ago. A design so effective, so simple, and so perfectly suited to its task that humanity genuinely never needed to significantly reinvent it, only refine the materials it was made from. And there is something quietly remarkable in that too. The idea that somewhere in a small workshop in ancient Rome, a craftsman solved a design problem so completely and so elegantly that his solution is still sitting, essentially unchanged, in drawers, in barbershops and salons in every country on earth today, unnoticed, ordinary, taken completely for granted. And if your mind is drifting now, slowly, heavily, that's exactly right. Just let it drift. There's nothing left to hold on to tightly here, just old bronze and iron, old combs and oils, old rituals and quiet, unnamed hands working patiently by candlelight across thousands of years. And before we finally bring everything together tonight, let's take one more slow, unhurried walk through a few civilizations we've only briefly touched. Because south of Egypt, along the same great river, stood the kingdom of Kush, sometimes called Nubia, a powerful and often overlooked African civilization that traded with, warred with, and at times even ruled over Egypt itself. And Kushite hairstyles were every bit as elaborate as their northern neighbors, with tightly curled hair, often worked into small ringlets close to the scalp, sometimes decorated with gold rings threaded directly into individual locks, a style that required extraordinary patience and skill to create and maintain. And Kushite royalty were frequently depicted in their own stone carvings wearing this exact style, a proud, distinct visual identity separate from Egyptian fashions even during periods when the two cultures were closely intertwined. And just north of Rome, before Rome itself had grown into the dominant power of the Italian peninsula, there lived the Etruscans, a mysterious and sophisticated civilization whose grooming customs quietly influenced later Roman practices in ways historians are still piecing together. Etruscan tomb paintings show both men and women with carefully styled hair, often shoulder length and gently curled, and Etruscan craftsmen were skilled metalworkers who produced finely made bronze mirrors, an essential tool for anyone trying to check their own hairstyle or trim their own beard evenly. And it's worth pausing on that detail for a moment too, the mirror itself, because for enormous stretches of ancient history, most ordinary people rarely saw a clear reflection of their own face at all. Polished bronze or silver mirrors were expensive, somewhat blurry by modern standards, and owned primarily by wealthier households, meaning that for a huge portion of the ancient world's population, getting a haircut meant trusting entirely in the skill and judgment of the barber standing behind you, with little or no ability to check the results yourself until you happened to catch your reflection in still water or a polished metal surface later that day. And if we drift finally towards Southeast Asia, we find cultures like the Khmer of ancient Cambodia and various early Vietnamese and Thai societies where elaborate court hairstyles, often involving tall, coiled arrangements decorated with gold ornaments, distinguished royalty and nobility from commoners, while religious ordination into Buddhist monastic life, much like in medieval European Christian monasteries, involved the ceremonial shaving of the entire head as a symbolic act of renouncing worldly vanity and beginning a new spiritual path, a practice that, remarkably, echoes almost exactly what we discussed earlier tonight regarding Christian monks and their tonsures, two completely separate religious traditions on opposite sides of the ancient world, arriving independently at the same basic symbolic gesture that shaving the head signals a spiritual rebirth, a stepping away from ordinary vanity and worldly concern. And now, let's simply slow down completely and sit for a while longer in the quiet atmosphere of all of this. Imagine, if you will, a single evening 2,000 years ago, somewhere along the Mediterranean coast. The sun has just gone down. The air is warm. Oil lamps are being lit one by one along a narrow stone street. And inside a small tonsure shop, the last customer of the day is seated on a low wooden stool, a barber standing behind him with a bronze razor in hand, moving slowly, carefully. The only sounds in the room, the quiet scrape of the blade, the occasional soft murmur of conversation, the distant noise of the city slowly settling down for the night outside, the smell of warm oil and faint smoke drifting through the small room. And this exact scene, this exact quiet, unremarkable moment happened over and over and over again, thousands upon thousands of times, in countless towns and cities, for centuries, an almost endless, gently repeating rhythm running quietly underneath the loud, dramatic history of wars and emperors and famous battles that most history books choose to focus on instead. And it's in these small, quiet, repeated moments, the barber and his client, the mother combing her child's hair by firelight, the servant slowly curling a nobleman's beard, the monk kneeling for his tonsure, that the real, lived texture of ancient daily life actually existed. And before we close tonight,